Aden, the stage is yours.
Thank you. All right. So thank you so much, Dahlia, for that warm welcome and introduction. And I'm really glad that I could be here. I want, first of all, to thank the organizers of the discourse panel and of the CTM festival more generally for bringing me here. It's really a rare pleasure to get to travel across an ocean to deliver a talk, and I'm so happy to be able to be here. I want to thank all of you too for showing up this very early morning to be here. I always like to start with excuses and apologies, lower expectations a little bit. And I have two. One apology is that I'm going to be reading my talk today. I used to be able to do these things more kind of extemporaneously, but I don't know if my brain's gotten crusty as I've aged. I don't seem to be able to do that, so I don't trust myself and have to read instead. That's not the most dynamic way to present, so forgive me for that. I'll try to have some nervous tics or something to make it more entertaining, but we'll see. And then the other one, maybe a little bit more seriously, is I've been working on this kind of material, the questions around the digital, since around 2002, which, though that wasn't the beginning of digital studies, at least not digital studies in the humanities, it was nevertheless relatively early days of digital studies. And so for, what is it now, 2018, so that's about 16 years that I've been plugging away at this topic. And I don't think that I figured it out yet. I mean, not that I would ever expect to figure it out entirely, but I am sort of pounding away at this message that Dahlia hinted at about both recognizing certain fantastic possibilities of the digital, but also trying to emphasize that there may be certain kinds of limits or certain things that get left out when we engage with digital technologies that we don't tend to recognize very often. And even though I keep beating this drum, I'm not sure that I've found the right words to say it. So I actually would be very appreciative if you could let me know if maybe this latest version of the message rings true or strikes home, or whether I'm still not quite there. I'm actually, in all seriousness, considering giving up pretty soon. I may move on to just a whole different topic. So that would be okay too. I like thinking about other things. So the talk is called The Digital and the Limits of Creativity, maybe? Something I can't remember, but something like that. Music is famously a temporal art. This certainly means, as one would expect, that music takes time, that it can be experienced over time, as opposed to an image like a photograph or a painting, which can be experienced all at once in a flash, or at least in a very short, almost negligible time. But music, as an art made of sound, engages time not just as a non-zero duration, something you have to wait for or sit through in order to get it, to have the experience of it. Music is a temporal art because it literally sculpts or manipulates time, because it is made materially of different frequencies, different paces that mark time. More fundamentally, sound is made of time in the sense that its character, which derives from an oscillating or vibrating motion, is determined by the speed of that oscillation, by how the oscillation chops up time. We call the different paces, different frequencies that combine to make the distinctive sound of a given instrument, timbre. So timbre is at its core sculpted time. Tone, timbre, pitch, melody, harmony, all of these are what they are by virtue of their distinct ways of materially gathering together and dividing up blocks of time, how it is divided, segmented, and rhythm is most obviously a matter of time, the way it's divided, segmented, gathered, and released. Film is also another temporal art, but its material is not first and foremost temporality itself, whereas music and sound more generally is primarily about techniques of shaping time. Music's particular relationship to time has experiential consequences. That is, the experience of music involves being situated in relation to time in directed ways, rather than neutral or indifferent ones. When, as a listener, you are moved by a piece of music, by any sound really, part of that experience of being moved is a sense of being caught up in something, which is to say, you might feel as though you are waiting for something to work itself out, to resolve itself, to return to its center, to get back in its groove, or just waiting for whatever is about to come next. As listeners, we don't usually articulate to ourselves or to those around us this feeling of being caught up, but it is surely symptomatized in one's body, the rhythm of one's breath, the patterns of stillness and motion in one's limbs, the tension in one's gut, the neck craned forward as though to give one's ears the best available spot from which to take in the sound. We don't usually say to ourselves, not even subvocally, that we are waiting, caught up, bewitched, or beguiled by the music, but our bodies say it for us, and they say it to us, and we certainly know when the music finally gets where it was going, releases us to our own attention and to the mundane concerns of life after the concert. This temporalized suspension in sound that dominates the experience of music, giving it its direction, drawing us in, catching us up, this waiting should be understood across different scales of music. I don't mean different sequences of pitches, not that kind of musical scale. I mean different temporal scales, so that we wait for the entry of the chorus, we wait for the downbeat in every bar, we wait for the harmony to land back on the one chord. We wait for that part where the drummer plays triplets, or the horns sound like whining dogs, or the guitar string fades away and can be heard no longer. At a microphysical scale, faster than our thresholds of conscious perception, we wait for the waveform that describes the sound to complete its cycle, to return to its center, finishing the pattern that tickles the insides of our ears, giving us the sensation that we call sound, out of which we make music. This is to describe an aspect of music from the listener's perspective, but what about the performer or player of music? From the player's perspective, there is also a waiting, but the player is the one, or is among those ones, who keep us waiting, holding off the resolutions, or allowing them to arrive, and then creating tension once again. There is a kind of headlong throwing of oneself into the music, perhaps even for listeners, but certainly for the players. One might expect that the player's job is to bring the music to its end, to bring about what is being waited for in the sound. But in fact, for the performer as for the listener, it's not a matter of getting ahead of oneself, of reaching the end, whatever one was waiting for. In fact, it's almost the opposite. The performer staves off the end, holds something in abeyance, keeps something open or suspended, a possibility undetermined, something still to come but not yet decided. The music must insist that it might go elsewhere. It must maintain an unpredictability to hold one's interest, to keep one waiting. It must avoid a foregone conclusion, stay unresolved, indeterminate, and this is the performer's charge. This is paradoxical, for one both heads toward resolution, or whatever waits, whatever is coming, but one also heads off that resolution, suspends it. And the paradox is still more twisted, still more intractable, for the player also has to rescue the music from dissolution. Made of sound, sustained only as long as there is more sound, including the sound of silence, music constantly threatens to fall to pieces, to fall apart, to dissolve, to break down. An improviser or a group of improvisers conspire to build the music out of this breaking down, to suspend the breaking down, to sustain the piece, to head towards what awaits, even without knowing, without deciding what awaits. I've been describing musical sound, listening to it, playing it, but I'm trying to describe something that isn't strictly describable. I don't mean to refer to something mystical or mythical, although I'm sure that some listeners and some musicians would talk about it in those terms. Rather, I am trying to describe something markedly concrete, something bodily, something that one experiences, knows in one's breath and one's heart and one's hips, but something that is nevertheless not exactly there. This waiting is not a posit, not a thing that we can place before us and examine. Consider for a moment another aspect of improvisation, although it is perhaps part of every musical experience, again, for player and listener alike. It's the question of what comes next, what to play or what to hear next. Fundamental to improvisation, constituting the conditions of possibility for improvisation, there can be no answer to this question of what next, except that answer delivered improvisationally and spontaneously as the music itself. A space must be held open. Any rules must be suspended. Again, this is a paradox not unique to improvisation, but felt there with especial intensity. For the improviser chooses what to play, but she also allows that choice to make itself. In fact, she wants to be surprised by what she plays. She wants to play what she cannot or has not conceived. So I've offered so far a coin with two sides. On one side, the listener, waiting, feeling that there is more, but knowing also that this more, what she is waiting for, is not definite, not determinate, not decided. She waits, and this waiting is a keeping open. Complementarily, the performer must both head toward the next moment of the music, but also somehow not know what it will be. The performer must share the sense of directed progress, even in static sound, drones or modal tunes, but a directed progress toward an end that is in principle unspecified, not yet determined or assured. The listener waits for what cannot be known, and the player is bound by no rule that would delimit or define her contribution. Only because it is not certain what will happen, where the music will go or will take its performers, its listeners, its concert hall or living room or street corner, only because of this essential openness does one wait with bated breath, wait for what one knows not yet. Following this logic to one of its conclusions, this suggests that even a recorded piece of music played back on one's earbuds or the sound system in your car, even the most familiar piece somehow retains this openness, this unknown, something to be discovered or revealed. As familiar as a given recording might be, something in your body refuses to know what will come next, waits in uncertainty for the next sound, the next motion. The unknown still to come, the sense of waiting is a part of the music there in its temporal constitution, and yet not isolatable or defined, not a particular part of the music. This unknown that remains unknown, even in a familiar recording, thus cannot have the character of a posit, a definite thing, for such a thing would be irredeemably the same thing in the same recording on the same speakers. So I offer this non-thing, this waiting, pending, baiting, that doesn't make music, but that makes music musical, that makes the experience of music, this thing without rule, facing an openness, in order to test the digital. To put the digital to the test by asking how it deals with this unruly non-thing that is part of the experience of sound. So I don't know whether this will be demystifying or just plain more mystifying, but I want to offer a kind of schematic description of how the digital works, to set up the question of what it might do particularly well and where it might fall short when it comes to music and sound. So how does the digital work? This might seem like a really big question, as digital technologies are nearly ubiquitous and do so many different things. Nevertheless, the basic operation of the digital is consistent across all of its devices, all of its technologies, and all of its activities. And in fact, the digital is remarkably, astonishingly simple. Everything that happens in a computer, everything that exists in a computer, all the objects on the screen, the menus, the cursors, the windows, the websites, the documents, the games, etc. All of it exists inside the machine as a binary code, a code made of zeros and ones. To be encoded is the universal and unshakable criterion for entry into the digital world. Everything digital is made of zeros and ones, and this goes not only for digital things, but for digital actions or processes. Whatever happens in a computer happens by virtue of instructions represented as a long list of zeros and ones. What I aim to demonstrate in the next few minutes is that these zeros and ones, bits as we usually call them, lend their ways of being to the objects and actions of digital devices. Bits are not just one choice of building blocks among others that might have served as the foundation of the digital. Rather, they are very special elemental parts of digital operation, and their particular way of being carries over into the objects and processes of the computer, and thus also into the computer user's interactions with the computer. If bits lend their character, their ways of being, to the whole operation of the computer, well, what are those ways of being? What sort of thing is a bit? I want to emphasize two things about this binary code that is the lingua franca of the digital world. First, it includes no ambiguity, no uncertainty. Every 0 is exactly a 0, and every 1 is exactly a 1, and there is no in-between, no middle ground, no sort of this and sort of that. Zeros and ones as elements of the digital are discrete and exact, self-identical. We could call this quality of bits positivism. Every bit is a positive, definitive, discrete thing, something and not nothing, formally distinct from every other bit. Second, notice that 0 and 1 constitute a severely limited vocabulary. The actual material world in which we live includes radical heterogeneity, things so different from each other that they defy comparison. Compare the idea of memory to the molecular composition of a stalk of asparagus. Compare the shared feeling of a crowd at a concert to the Pythagorean theorem. Such comparisons don't make sense, and even comparisons that do make sense might be complicated and multivalent. But in the digital, because everything, every object and every action is spoken in a language of nothing but 0 and 1, everything is comparable to everything else. All differences are some combination of the simple difference between 0 and 1. In order to make everything comparable or assimilable, in order to use bits as a universal language, a language that can be used to represent anything and everything digital, the bit must first be drained of any bias, any meaning of its own. That is, bits must be made to behave as perfect, empty, logical placeholders, each distinct from each other, and each value meaning nothing more than its difference from the other. In practice, it has been a serious engineering challenge to develop technologies that realize such perfection. How do we store and manipulate bits in ways that keep them from blurring into each other? Electrical and magnetic fields tend to be somewhat diffuse, so it requires special materials and protocols of storage to use these fields to store bits as individuated and reliably readable and writable. Even more significant is the engineering trick used to ensure that bits have exact values. After all, the real world rarely exhibits the same degree of exactness that is required in the digital realm. In a mountain range, the mountains typically gather together such that there are plenty of places along a given rise that cannot be said strictly to belong to one mountain or to the adjacent one. And even a very carefully created voltage value, regulated by an expensive power conditioner, will still fail to measure exactly the nominal value associated with that system. 230 volts is an ideal, but in the real world, measurements are only ever close to that ideal. To address this problem for the digital, where the system operates based on a logic that requires not just high precision, but perfect logical exactitude, engineers designed the system to treat inexact but close values as though they are exact. In other words, if a given computer system uses a voltage of plus 5 volts to represent a digital 1 bit and plus 2 volts to represent a digital 0 bit, then the system is designed so that any value close to plus 5 volts is treated as an exact 1 bit, and any value close to plus 2 volts is treated as a 0 bit. This concession to the fuzziness of reality has significant consequences for the nature of digital operation, for it essentially allows bits, even as material things in the real world, to work as though they were perfect idealizations of bits. We could say that the bit is an abstraction rendered material, an abstraction that remains abstract even when it is concretized. And this abstraction, this perfect idealization, underlies the remarkable power of the digital, its fantastic breadth of application, its incredible speed, its tiny size, and amazing efficiency. It is because bits are so simple, so neutral, predictable, unambiguous, and without resistance that they can accept just about any meaning we'd care to assign them. That is, because they say nothing in themselves, they are ready to represent whatever we want to use them for. so that we can use bits to represent text or image or chemical interactions or corporate spending patterns or manufacturing processes or really any information at all. And because they are so minimal, so unassuming, so frictionless, they can move at the speed of electricity or light, gather in billions and trillions into a tiny flash drive, reproduce exactly and perfectly with almost no effort and more. The digital is a revolutionary technology among, even when compared to other revolutionary technologies, because it operates on the basis of material abstraction, because it behaves as though it were its own idealization, its own perfection. Remember the Sony Corporation's advertising slogan at the introduction of the compact disc around 1984, "Perfect sound forever." I don't think most of you do remember that, but I do. A world made of bits, as I've been describing the digital, would be so smooth that it would never encounter our own material, textured world. For a bit value of 0 or 1 to become significant to a person, it must be taken to represent something, which is to say, bits in digital technologies like computers are given meaning through a code that interprets those bits as representing numbers, and those numbers as giving instructions about how to produce images on the computer screen and sound from the computer speakers. Additional code indicates how to take information from outside of the computer, such as mouse clicks or microphone input, and turn it into numbers that can interact with the numbers already there in the machine to produce new numbers representing images and sounds. This code is also largely made of bits. It is a list of zeros and ones that encodes the rules for how to turn other lists of zeros and ones into shapes, colors, text, data fields, and instructions for altering or copying or deleting those things. And this is important, for it means that digital objects are fundamentally governed by rules. Before there can be a digital object like a menu at the top of your screen or window, there has to be a rule in the form of an algorithm to decide how to take a bunch of bits and interpret them as a list of items for a menu. There has to be a rule or a form telling the computer hardware how to parse a list of bits to determine where the bits corresponding to one menu item end and the bits corresponding to the next menu item begin. There has to be a rule telling the hardware how to know which bits are to be understood as the title of the menu, which bits indicate whether the menu is currently visible on the screen, which bits indicate whether the menu is open or rolled up into its title. And this is true for every digital object, from windows to icons to applications to sound files. It must first be outlined as a general rule, a structure or form, before it can be given content. For a list of numbers representing a sound, the translation code must specify how those numbers should be turned back into sound. There are different ways to do so, though most typically the list of numbers is taken to describe the varying magnitude of a signal that represents a waveform that ultimately models the rapid change in air pressure that serves as sound's material being. But that list of numbers representing a sound would not represent anything were there not a pre-existing code describing how to understand that list of numbers as constituting a sound. Not only objects in the computer, but actions that need to enter the digital device are also bound by encoded rules. Every possible input to a computer must already have been anticipated as a general form. Clicking the mouse button only has any effect in the computer because there are algorithms that exist that tell the computer hardware what to do when that button is clicked. If you are playing a computer game and you run past a wall with a crack in it, you may be able to hide in that crack, but only if some programmer has written code that determines how the crack can be used and how your avatar's body can use space in that virtual world. Without such code, that crack might as well be painted onto the wall, for it can do nothing that has not been explicitly programmed, given a rule for its operation. Rules specify the form of a digital object, and they generally do so by grouping together the object's parts, each of which is itself given in outline by a rule. This is a pretty tidy system, and much mess is avoided because all the digital objects and all of their parts are, like bits, discrete. Each object is made of bits, and because each of its parts is also made of bits, every object and every part, like the bits themselves, is perfectly defined and perfectly individuated. Because bits are discrete, no matter how many of them you group together and no matter how complicated that organization of bits may become, it remains an organization of discrete things. The bits that constitute an image or a sound, even a very diffuse or blurry-looking image, and even a very noisy sound with a slow attack and a long decay, even such fuzzy images and sounds as digital things must be perfectly discrete. There is an exact moment when the digital sound begins and another exact moment when it ceases. The fuzziest digital image is still a precisely articulable collection of pixels. The most diffuse digital sound is still a list of discrete and exact numerical values. This is what it means to be digital. In fact, it's the definition of the digital. The digital embraces a thoroughgoing positivism. Like a bit, a digital thing is or is not, and there is no ambiguity, no partial being, no in-between. When we combine this observation about the positivism of digital things, their discrete and unambiguous existence as an exactly defined group of numbers or bits, when we combine this with the earlier observation about how the form of a digital thing must pre-exist its digital content, we arrive at a further conclusion. Namely, digital objects are first of all established as objects and only secondly take on relations to other objects. And this goes also for the way that objects behave. The way an object appears and the way that it acts are completely independent of each other, because the rules that govern appearance are independent of the rules that govern or determine action. Thus, a digital cello, or what appears on your computer screen as a representation of a cello, could make sounds that we associate not with a cello, but with machine guns, or crying babies, or a clarinet. That same digital cello can have strings made of crocodile teeth, but this need have no effect on the sound produced. Its body can be made of simulated lead or cotton balls, but this need make no difference to the way it sounds. And because all of its parts are independent, nothing is easier than to change, for example, the color of the cello without changing anything else. Maybe make it a bright orange. Or change the size of the cello. Why not make it really big, like another planet, to make up for the recent loss of Pluto? In the digital, the independence of each part, of each object, of each bit, of each behavior, the way in which each is governed by a set of rules in principle independent of the others, means that there is no inherent relationship between a thing's form and its content, or between its appearance and its behavior. Any change can be made in isolation without repercussion, without further consequence. But this doesn't, of course, quite tell the whole story. After all, what makes computers so useful, so powerful, is that they simulate processes where changes to one variable or part of the simulation are reflected in all the other parts. A digital weather simulation wouldn't predict anything useful if, when you add in a bunch of clouds, it doesn't simulate the effect of clouds on other aspects of the weather. Thus, digital objects and processes generally include encoded rules that establish connections between parts of an object or between the appearance and behavior of an object. If the appropriate rules have been written as code, then adding in clouds will likely lower the predicted ground temperature and increase the chance of rain. If the encoded rules are in place, then making the cello larger will also make it produce deeper sounds, and changing its base material from wood to orange juice will cause it to collapse in a pulpy puddle. So there can be relationships among digital parts and between an object's behavior and appearance, but any such relationships must be explicitly put there by the construction of encoded rules to enforce that relationship. And the parts will interact only in the specific ways that the rules have already anticipated. Somebody has to intentionally specify every relationship and inscribe it as code, or that relationship will not obtain. Compare this digital state of affairs to the actual material world. In the real world, things and their parts, their forms and their contents are not independent, for they answer to the same reason, a shared history. The roof, walls, and floor of a building respond to an overarching logic of habitation, of shelter, property, gravity, human scale, human aesthetics, human needs, and ways of moving, sleeping, and living. It's not a simple logic, but it guides all the parts of a building, ensuring their coordination and their interrelatedness. An example from nature might illustrate even more readily. All the parts of a lemon respond to the same set of forces, such that each part, the pulp, the peel, the seeds, the shape, the color, the flavor, the chemical constituents, its economic dynamics, its role in cooking, its variable place in culture, all of these aspects of a lemon are tied together by its history, its reason that makes it what it is, determining in a coordinated evolution its form and content, its appearance and many behaviors. By contrast, a digital lemon would have a shape determined by one algorithm, a color by another, and a set of possibilities given by still other algorithms. And all of these algorithms are in principle independent of each other. If its parts are coordinated, if the digital lemon has a coherence, it is only because that coherence has been deliberately placed there by some programmer, some rule maker who determined each part of the lemon as well as their relationships after the fact. A digital lemon is a collection of digital lemon parts and digital lemon qualities, and there is nothing about the digital lemon that guarantees any coordination among these parts and qualities. The perfectly defined quality of a digital object means that one can easily make 10,000 copies of the digital lemon in only a few keystrokes at the computer, but the world becomes no more sour as a result, unless someone has written code to sour the world based on the number of simulated lemons in it. Because digital things have no reason in themselves, no principled coherence, but only an assigned coherence, digital time and digital space are similarly independent and detached from temporal and spatial digital objects. A digital object can be made in a simulation arbitrarily large or small, just as a process in a digital simulation can be arbitrarily rapid or plodding. As representations made of pure abstraction, space and time do not exert in the digital the sorts of inexorable constraints and directed possibilities that they do in the actual. Solar systems and molecules can appear side by side on the screen. Thousands of simulated years can be compressed into a second. Or a complex process can be slowed down, stopped, reversed, or resequenced for observation and analysis. Simulated objects, untethered from a materiality that would give them particular characteristics, need not behave like the objects they appear to be. A massive mountain can yield entirely to the tip of a pencil. A ruler can oversee millennia of continuous history. A refrigerator can transform smoothly into a set of keys. Given their constitution of equivocal bits, digital objects can never have their reasons in themselves, can never make the kind of sense that falls to actual objects by dint of their histories, their materials, their places in the world. Time and space are just more bits, more numbers to be spooled out by the computing machine according to no logic but that imposed piecemeal by the coder. The distinctive characteristics of the digital that I've been describing, all based on the essential positivism of bits, are both the foundation of the digital's awesome possibilities and its inevitable poverty. As an essentially individual posit, every part of a digital object can be independently manipulated, copied, moved, or otherwise altered, providing an extraordinary flexibility and precision. A digital visual artist can alter a single pixel at a time, nudging its color almost imperceptibly darker or more blue, without any effect on the pixels nearby. A traditional painter with a material paintbrush has no such precise control and must accept the accidents, the extra unintended effects that supplement even the greatest technical ability, sometimes serving as the very source of creative possibility. This superfine digital control, this exposure of every part of the object, the possibility of massaging every tenth of a second of sound in a recording, is incredibly powerful and markedly different from pre-digital modes of production. But the same radical independence of all the parts of a digital object that makes possible such precision and control also means that our demand for that perfection is steadily increasing. We expect each pixel, each moment of sound to be deliberately and intentionally manipulated. In the digital, because there has to be a rule for everything, nothing comes for free. Every creative move must be deliberated and decided, or one ends up falling back into a homogeneous default, an uncreative baseline. So to return to the experience of music that I attempted to describe at the outset of this talk, what becomes in the digital of this waiting, of this non-thing that is nevertheless part of the music? It can't really have a number assigned to it. It can't be represented in bits because it isn't a posit. It isn't strictly separable from its environment, capturable as parts and qualities, manipulable as a discrete entity. Music, or sculpted time, is motion, but digital sound, as a sequence of numbers, has no associated motion. On the contrary, digitally captured sound sits still, a list of numbers represented in a binary code in some static physical medium, vast chains of zeros and ones written out as pits on the reflective surface of a shiny disk, or as the relative alignments of tiny magnetic particles. The digital stays sound, stills its relentless and essential motion by burying that motion in a code, a rule that instructs the machine regarding how to take the list of numbers and turn it back into a signal that can be played as sound. The basis of music as experience involves an experience of time that is not confined to the sound one is hearing now at a given moment. In fact, there is no sound that is heard in an instant, because sound is essentially duration. It necessarily includes a span of time, and music leverages this temporal duration to gather past, present, and future into the experience itself. Music is concretely experienced as what one has already heard and what one has still to hear. And the success of music depends on the coordination of past, present, and future that one hears in the music itself. That's the basis of the waiting that I referred to at the outset of this talk, the way that there is a waiting that is part of the sound one is hearing right now, a real lived experience of the future as pending, indefinite, to be determined. But the digital, because it is always piecemeal, because each of its parts is inherently independent of the others, the digital can only establish a contrived or artificial coordination among its parts. There is no necessary relationship in the digital between the sounding sound right now and the sounding sound a few moments from now. An acoustic instrument helps to guarantee this relationship between past and future in its body, as it produces a whole sound that is heard as a whole, even as it stretches over a duration. An actual non-digital sound has a coherence that gathers its parts together, a direction it is going not by accident, but by virtue of its production in a self-same thing. A person, an animal, an object, the wind, may make a great variety of sounds, but those sounds still carry with them the character of their origins, the distinctive motion, vibration that sent them on their way. The attack and decay of a strummed guitar string are not unrelated to each other, however different they sound. Although they arise at different moments of a process, it is nevertheless a process in a consistent and self-same material, guided by a consistent, if complex, set of physical laws. The disassembly of sound into minute parts, a hallmark of digital capture and reproduction, offers prodigious strengths, even as it weakens the integrity of sonic temporal experience. In the digital, there is no sonic context, no instrument, no audience that would shape the sound and make it cohere in itself, pushing toward what comes next, even as it keeps it open and indeterminate. Instead, every sound is available. Every sound can be simulated, synthesized, called up as a sample. Artists working in the digital have the entirety of the sonic domain at their disposal, for the digital is prepared to synthesize everything indiscriminately. It's just a matter of making the right list of numbers, and the numbers don't care which ones of them you choose. A record today, any record, but especially the most commercially oriented, has every second, even every millisecond of sound massaged, edited, corrected, polished. It's not just that the compressor and the EQ remain engaged for the whole track. It's also that each moment of the tune provides an opportunity for another tweak of the compressor, maybe a slight modification of the ratio or threshold, maybe a little bump in the lower mids, to make sure everything is just as the producers, engineers, and artists want it. Sound in the digital, rather than expressing its own coherence, following its logic, responding to the performer and pushing back against the performer, sound in the digital is entirely a matter of intention, subject to random access micromanagement and manipulation. I don't know whether you hear all of this in digital sound today, and so many sounds today have spent part of their lives in the digital. I don't even know if I hear what I'm talking about, feel it in the sound. I would expect the effects of the digital revolution in sound to show up as broad aesthetic shifts, ways in which music, produced under this new regime of absolute and perfect control, sacrifices something raw and spontaneous. I would expect that our expectations in general about what sounds good and what it means to sound good have slid toward the slick, the error-free sound of the digital, even as counter-aesthetic movements re-embrace non-digital modes of live acoustic instruments and vinyl recordings. I would expect to see it in subtle changes in the moves on the dance floor, the nature of collaborations among musical artists, a reduction of nuanced differences in favor of the crude but thrilling peaks and valleys of digital production. The aim of this talk, then, is not so much to propose a hard limit on what the digital can or can't do with sound. After all, anything in particular found missing from a digital sound can always be added in with the introduction of a new rule or some more bits. Rather, I am suggesting that there is a mismatch or disconnect between sound, especially musical sound, and the digital. Musical sound is coherent and relies on a temporal synthesis of past, present, and future, while the digital has only the reasons that someone has invested in it and breaks down everything into small parts whose independence resists temporal synthesis. Musical sound is essentially open and uncertain, waiting for what comes next, while the digital requires a pre-existing rule to govern its every object. We're more than 50 years into the digital revolution, and it's made our world better in uncountable ways. But I'm not sure that anyone is asking the question, what do you hear? Oh, there you are.
Thank you, Aden, for these really interesting insights in the digital operation and the characteristics of digital music production. Are there any questions from the audience? Can we have the mic, please? Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the inspiring talk. I just want to challenge two assumptions you made a little bit. The first is the digital, and the second is about the rules that you said. I think you described the digital very well, but you could have said the same about humans by noticing that in our brains we have neurons that either fire or not. So on this level of biology, of our brains, we are digital. And a neuron fires or it doesn't fire, and there is nothing in between. There are other things in play, like hormones and things like that, but in the computer you could look at several similar phenomena. A computer can measure their own temperature, for example. So the level of comparison between human and non-human, I think, is very important. And you choose, with a bit, you choose a very microscopic level. And I would say, you could say the human is digital as well on that level. And you need to add other descriptions to it to make a distinction. And the second thing about the rules, I think that actually needs an update, because you said everything the computer does must be have been pre-programmed by a human. That doesn't hold anymore. We have machine learning, which basically means that the computer, the rules are created by interaction with the environment. So the computer gets input from the environment, and the rules are formed on the basis of this input. Of course, the algorithms that describe this process are themselves programmed by humans, but at some point, there is no human that describes what the computer will do. The computer learns it. The word learning is a bit questionable here, but the computer gets this from interaction by itself, basically. Mm-hmm. So that would be my two kind of objections to the arguments.
Those both seem like very important objections, and I'm certain I don't have definitive responses to them. But one thing that I would suggest is I'm not ready yet, and maybe I'm just sort of desperately holding out. I mean, I don't even think of myself as a humanist, but maybe this is a humanist side of me. I'm not ready yet to concede that our persons, our neurology operates on what is essentially a digital basis. It's not, I mean, you say a neuron either fires or it doesn't, and I suppose that that's true, but if you look at interactions among neurons, in fact, there has to be a buildup, a slow buildup, I mean, slow is a relative term, but a slow buildup of ionic potential before a neuron fires, and what determines that buildup is a pretty complicated chemical process, which might turn out to be digitally describable, but then again, it's not certain that it will, in the end, be digitally describable. But beyond that, I would say that even if it does turn out that we can digitally simulate, or at least describe as a digital system, the firing of neurons, I mean, I know that neurobiologists and neurologists want to insist that that's basically what it means to be conscious, is neurons firing, but we don't really have any idea what it means. I mean, maybe it's the ionic buildup that constitutes consciousness. Maybe it's other chemical processes going on in our brains and in our bodies that constitutes consciousness. As I say, I say that knowing that those are marginal perspectives that are increasingly unpopular, because I think more and more the consensus is that it's about neurons firing, that's what thought or human consciousness and unconscious amounts to. But I'm not ready to concede that point. I mean, I sort of hope that that's not true. And there's no doubt but that neuroscientists want to believe that, because then they can claim to have the answer to what it really means to be human. And I'm ready to fight with neuroscientists about that. As to the other point about rules, I mean, I think you answered that yourself, even though it's true that in deep learning systems, in certain kinds of artificial intelligence, the digital system itself develops what we might call rules, develops new algorithms that weren't explicitly put there by human beings. It's nevertheless the case that those are still pre-existing rules that determine what kinds of objects that system can deal with. That is to say, the system has to have developed those rules before it can deal with the new input that those rules are intended to apply to. And moreover, as you say, the possibility of those rules is itself already determined by a system of algorithmically encoded rules that human beings have intentionally put there in order to create the kinds of rules that the system then generates. So I'm not sure that it really gets us out of the basic problem that there is this divide between form and content. It moves in that direction, and I think I do concede that my rhetoric here needs an update. I mean, I think I need to deal with some of these more recent, I mean, they're not that recent. Neural networks have been around since, what, the 70s or something? So, in fact, maybe this needed an update when I started to write it. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, as well, thank you for getting medias in res right to the point, catching the digital with the bits. But then maybe there the problem starts, because the computer is not an adding machine, adding zeros and ones. We have had adding machines for a long time. This is not the computer. The bit means binary information unit. And there is nothing more delicate than the theory of information developed by Shannon and others, who resulted in an aesthetics of dealing with uncertainties. So what could be more creative, actually, than the theory of information for which the bit has been a useful application to turn it into a machine process? Whole cybernetic aesthetics has developed a rich vision of creativity, which is still actual, I would say, just that our computers are now more powerful to realize it. So, isn't there a danger of you present us the real world as something continuous, steady, with enduring, and then there is something artificial rule governed like the discrete. This is metaphysics. As my colleague has already hinted at, the world might be much more digital in itself, and the computer, which is a real embodiment of something, is a very analog machine. But may I finally say, there is an ongoing confusion in many discussions when it comes to sound and the digital. Do we use the word music or sound? Because music, as the science of music for 2,500 years, has been as mathematical as computing itself. From times of Pythagoras, whom you mentioned, over Johann Sebastian Bach and Leibniz and others. So music, as such, is brother or sister of computing in terms of ratios. Sound, as you pointed out, is something very material. But then I think the intelligence and the marvel of the digital is that by the so-called sampling theorem, it proved possible that you can reproduce digitally an analog sound with perfect signal fidelity. I think this is a wonder of what has happened with computing, which we have not yet digested, and we continue dividing the world into the digital and the analog. No, the digital, because it's mathematical algorithmic intelligence, has developed a mechanism and a theory and a practice which even swallows the analog. And I think this is something culturally we still lag behind with our words we use, with our concepts we use. I think that the digital intelligence has already transgressed this opposition of the analog and the digital. So you see, you have really inspired at least me and others to continue. Yes.
Well, I would like to respond, and this is unusual for me, but I feel like I just want to disagree at most points with what you've said. Though there's a couple things that I don't quite understand. I'm not sure what you have in mind when you refer to aesthetics in information aesthetics. I mean, I've heard that term, cybernetic aesthetics, as well, but I guess I don't quite know what it refers to in this context. But let me respond a little bit, and maybe you can then help me to understand. In my talk, to start with, the computer is an adding machine. That's what it does with the zeros and ones. It adds them together. If you examine a machine code, assembly code, that any higher level programming language gets turned into before it can operate on the computer, if you look at what's happening on a computer chip, it's very simple addition-style manipulations of zeros and ones. The bits get copied from place to place. The bits get added as integer numbers to each other. The bits get shifted around so that their patterns change a little bit. But there's nothing complicated about any of that. It's just simple addition. To the extent that there are, and here I'm going to use this term aesthetics without quite knowing what you mean for it to refer to the extent that there is this kind of information science that connects these bits to a much richer world, a world of meaning that includes meaning for us human beings, that richness has to come from outside, again, in the form of what I referred to in the talk as a set of rules for deciding how those simple arithmetic calculations that happen within the computer are supposed to change, manipulate a set of numbers so that they become translatable into images and sounds that mean something to us. But as far as the manipulations go in the machine itself, they're still just arithmetic calculations. There's nothing, except to the extent that arithmetic is beautiful, there's nothing aesthetic or wonderful about those calculations. They're very simple. So I'm not sure what the nature of that objection is. I mean, this information aesthetics, is it something that we appreciate from outside as we use these information technologies and they present to us certain possibilities and we regard those possibilities as beautiful? Or are you claiming that in some sense what's going on in the machine is itself an aesthetically admirable set of events? No, all right.
Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah.
Just to quickly answer, in Germany, Max Benze, in France, Abraham Moles, and even Shannon himself played with it. Information aesthetics is about trying to calculate something like our impression of beauty in terms which you actually mentioned, something like why do we like an innovative, surprising piece of painting or music more than one which is redundant, where we already see what we have seen before. And that can be mathematically calculated by stochastical mathematics, for which you can use the computer as the most precise machine. So something like what we find exciting in art can be caught by informational aesthetics, by the very bits, as long as you treat them as an algorithmic, radically mathematical machine. And so I think it's reducing the computer to the bits is missing the point of what computing and what Turing is. And may I finally say, nothing is more musical than the computer itself. There are artists who sonify the computer. You have all what you look for in the beginning of your talk, which you attach to music. Duration, delay, cycling, return, suspension, it all happens in the orchestra which we call the von Neumann computing. So I see hope in the end that music and digital creativity is not contradiction, but you can find it by exactly as you did, looking closely at time-based processes, which is computing.
So in the, one of the chief researchers, the chair of the digital musics department where I work at Dartmouth College, his primary research area is generating algorithms that will both measure the beauty or aesthetic appeal of pieces of music, as well as generate new pieces. I mean, I wouldn't say it's an utter failure, but this work is still in its infancy, and it's rather surprising to me that you can sort of claim point blank that in fact this is mathematically calculable. We've figured out what makes a piece of music appealing aesthetically. I mean, we're at the beginning of such research, and it doesn't seem to me there's any guarantee we're going to get to the end of such research. My impression is that even to the extent that we're engaging with questions around the mathematization of music and the algorithmic capture of aesthetic qualities of music and sound, those fields have to content themselves with working in a kind of dialectical intersection between the part of the part of beauty that is algorithmically capturable, and then this surplus, this extra that we haven't figured out how to capture yet. So yeah, we can get computers to write pieces of music that have a certain popular appeal, but they're not doing it as well as good composers who write music that has popular appeal, at least not yet. I mean, maybe they will. I don't know the future, so I can't rule that out. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, okay, maybe we leave it at that. I have another question. Actually, I found your description of the process of digital music making pretty convincing, but at the end, actually you posed this question yourself. I wonder if it really does make any difference for the listener, because what we hear is waveforms anyway. It's motion in the air, and yeah, I think in the music making process there's a big difference you can notice, but does it really make such a big difference for the listeners?
Well, I don't know. I mean, my contention is that yes, it does make a big difference. Is it the Nyquist theorem that you referred to a moment ago? So, I mean, we know that we can capture by sampling at a sufficiently high resolution. We know that we can capture all those aspects, all those frequencies of a given sound up to a particular point, and assuming that we capture all the sound up to a particular frequency, and assuming that that frequency is high enough so that it's above the threshold of human hearing, presumably we've been able to capture all the aspects of that sound that human beings can hear, and therefore there shouldn't be any difference between the numerical representation in a computer of frequencies of a sound and what we end up hearing. But what I was trying to argue in this paper, in the introduction and the conclusion to the paper, is that there does seem to be something more, something other than those frequencies. And I claim that this is not a mystical or mythical claim itself, but now it's feeling more and more as though it is. I mean, confronted with this mathematization of sound, I don't know what it is that I'm pointing to when I refer to this temporal experience. It has something to do with the context in which the hearing is taking place. But yeah, I'm backed into a corner here.
Where's the mic?
Hey, I also want to make a comment about the human-machine difference. Yeah, maybe the computer can learn a lot of stuff and can maybe at the end have some creativity, but why? I mean, why we are so much digging into what the computer can do when we are still missing so much about our human selves? I mean, there's still so much about human communication and human-animal communication that we don't know so much about it. And we are digging about the computer, but I think we are missing also a lot.
Yeah, I really like that question. I kind of want to take both sides. I mean, on the one hand, as a writer, as a musical artist, I love using computers. I find them immensely valuable. I mean, digital techniques, for somebody like me, who I'm not technically all that proficient at the instruments that I play, it makes it possible for me to make really, well, for me at least, very interesting, original music that I wouldn't be able to create otherwise. So presumably, for a lot of people, the reason that they turn to computers is because it allows them to do things that they wouldn't be able to do as well if they didn't have those machines. It speeds up various parts of the process of producing music. It does all sorts of great things for our creativity, acting as a supplement to memory, acting as a calculator for extremely large amounts of data, things that we are limited and can't do. The computer can help us do better. So I understand the appeal there. It also, as some of these comments have suggested, may allow us to answer those very questions that you were just suggesting were really important. That is, it may help us to understand human creativity better if we can simulate creativity on a computer. Partly because, as my talk was suggesting, there's something exposed about whatever goes on inside of a digital machine. We can see the creativity happening when we simulate it, and therefore draw conclusions about how creativity works in general. So I see lots of reasons why people might want to use computers, but I think part of it also is just it's a cultural commonplace. There's a kind of unquestioned assumption that going digital is better than not going digital if it's possible to do. And I think indeed that's where my talk that's the itch that gets this talk started, is the feeling that maybe that's something we might challenge. It's really, the talk is not meant to say, let's throw away the computers, they're not doing us any good. On the contrary, it's meant to recognize that they're doing us a great deal of good and helping us a lot, but also to urge that we engage carefully and critically with digital technologies, lest we end up giving up something that we might eventually miss or never realize that we should have missed from the beginning.
Yes, one more question, and where's the mic? Never mind.
Thank you. The last thing you just said brought up a new aspect in my brain. So I was just wondering if you're thinking about different levels of creativity, or do you define creativity with a small or with a capital C? Because now comes the question. What you said, digital media can be sort of assistive, can help you as a non-professional musician to perform better or to produce better production stuff. Looking back at the history, I mean, it's not something very new to digital media, but also electroacoustic music production. There was a high difference between, let's say, amateur or semi-pro musicians and like big inventions or big creative inventions. People would have the power and, of course, the knowledge or the expertise. So, is it that we maybe should have two aspects, as you said, like two parts of one coin? So, on the one hand, we're talking about empowerment, empowering people to like offer their new, like small creative products to a possibly global audience, and on the other hand, you have to invest a little more. You have to like raise your expertise. That maybe includes nowadays taking care of programming stuff, setting up your own rules, or to be able to misuse technology to be even more creative. Is this also like, that would be like the capital C approach, and the small one would be like the empowerment aspect of digital media?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've fully understood the distinction, but it sounds as though you're saying, look, there's all kinds of different ways in which we might engage with computers. We might use them. I thought the distinction you were going to make, and maybe this didn't end up being it, was between entrusting the creative process to the machine versus no. So it's the machine as assisting in creative pursuits, you know, helping to store recorded sound, maybe sequencing it in a sequencer, versus what then? What was the capital C possibility?
Overcoming the rules, or setting up the new rules by being able to program, for instance. You know? Right, so it actually puts you to the test to sit down and to understand those rules, or to set them or overcome those rules. That would be the other side.
I see. Yeah, well, it does seem as though, I don't know that it's a hard and fast distinction. I feel as though when you start pushing the idea of, say, programming, it turns out that almost any act you make at the computer is an act of programming. I mean, it's offering input to the computer to reset its parameters such that different output results. It's a matter of engaging certain possibilities by opening up some possibilities and restricting others. And so every act is kind of an act of programming, but there are much more sophisticated kinds of programming that people can do, and presumably, as you say, they require a greater expertise, whereas sitting down with GarageBand requires very little expertise. And yeah, we might, I mean, it seems to me that it might be helpful to distinguish between those two different ways of engaging creatively with the computer, partly because it would help us to distinguish, not strictly, but to distinguish between different populations of computer users and the kinds of advice or critique that we might offer to those different populations. Yeah, that's helpful.